And welcome. Yes, you are listening indeed to Three Women here live at CIUT 89.5 FM. I'm your host, Sherry DeNovo, MPP Parkdale High Park, and we're talking today about precarious labor and a particular strike actually out at Fresh Taste. Quite a bit of news actually, and not like every strike, but ended successfully. We're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about the whole area of labor, actually, the underemployed, the part-time, the precarious. And we're going to talk to two women who know more than just about anybody else about this topic. First, we're talking to Jenny On, who is the assistant to Jerry Diaz, head of Unifor. He's the national president. She's been a social activist. She's won an award for being a social activist, and she's also won the Urban Alliance on Race Relations award. She's also been active in unions pretty well all her working life. So, Jenny, are you there?
Yes, I am, and thank you for having me on the show.
Of course, welcome. So let's start talking in the general sense about precarious work in Ontario and what that looks like now. What does it look like?
Well, unfortunately, there's growing numbers of precarious work, and people might say, well, what is precarious work? And I think when we talk about the growing numbers of part-time jobs where people don't have a sense of their schedules, jobs that don't pay a living wage, and there's lower and lower standards in terms of wages, lack of benefits, lack of a pension plan. All of those pieces are jobs that we're seeing far too often and in growing numbers, and that's a pretty scary thing, I think, here in this province.
And I've heard one stat that there's about half of all work now is contract or part-time or precarious in Ontario. That's shocking. So this isn't just a problem for students. This isn't a problem for the young. This is a problem for everybody.
Absolutely. And I think that is the surprising factor. But again, I think that it's also the reality that people know that it's not just those that are students or young people. These are workers of all different generations and ages, right across many different sectors, not just service sector type jobs where people might think, oh, if you work in a restaurant or the Tim Hortons or things like that. It's not just in those sectors. In fact, I think there's some kind of precarious work almost in every sector of the economy, and again, all different ages. And sometimes it's really sad, but you'll find people who have worked all their life and they should be retired, living with dignity and enjoying their retirement years, but you'll find so many people who are over the age of 65 who are working in precarious work, not because they choose to, but because they don't have enough in terms of their pension to not work to make ends meet so that they don't live in continuous poverty. And then, unfortunately, the kind of jobs that they're in, even in their retirement years, are in precarious type work.
There's only, just so folk know that are listening in, there's only about 1 in 3 Ontarians that actually have a defined benefit pension plan. Everybody else is really, unless you've managed to save up a whole lot of money, you're dependent on CPP and OAS. And really at the end of the day, there's a lot of people living on about $1,200 a month as seniors, which is shocking, which is below the poverty line and that's a real problem. So as a member of the union movement forever, Jenny, why such low rates of unionization? What is the problem in trying to organize more?
Well, I think that there's a number of different factors. I don't believe in our formal education system that students, young people, learn about the benefits of having a union when they go to school. So unfortunately, they don't learn about the chances and the advantages of having a unionized jobs until they are actually out in that workforce and they realize that there might be, a discrimination or unfairness inside the workplace, health and safety violations, and so on. And without having that kind of knowledge, they learn the hard way. I also believe that mainstream media often portrays unions in a negative light, looking at strikes and labor disputes, and people get very nervous when they're in a precarious job. They're worried about job security, having a paycheck to bring back so that they can feed their family. But the reality is about 97 to 98% of all collective agreements of negotiations are settled with in success without any kind of a strike or a labor dispute. So those are some of the factors. We also have legislation that could be changed to make it more fair, whether people want to join a union, but we're finding that things are not that simple. And back in the Mike Harris years, with that conservative government, they changed the legislation, making it more difficult for workers to join a union. And in fact, once you had a majority of workers who voted in favor or who signed a card who said, I am interested in being represented by a union, there is 5 days from when workers sign a card to join the union that an employer can intimidate those workers. 5 days where they have to show up to work, where that employer knows that these workers want to join a union, and often during those 5 days between signing the card and saying that they would like to be represented by a union to having another vote, that many of them get scared and intimidated by that employer. So we've seen since that change in legislation back with Mike Harris that there are less and less workers joining unions since then than ever before. And I'd like to ask any elected person where they have to go through a two-step process of trying to have a democratic system versus the one system that allows these workers to join unions. So legislation has to change, I believe, to make it more fair and equitable, make it fair whether they want to join a union or whether they don't want to or not have a union represent them anymore. So these are some of the factors, I believe, and again, with the increased numbers of precarious type jobs out there, workers are nervous, but they should know in joining a union, you have better job protection, you have better fairness, you have an advocate, you have a representative that can help fix problems inside the workplace, but also you have a legal avenue of representation so that an employer can't just do willy-nilly whatever they feel like to you as that individual worker trying to fix your problems by yourself. It can be pretty scary out there, and that's why I think unions are relevant even more than ever today. But again, there is still a lot of that fear and intimidation that happens inside the workplace.
One of the other pieces of legislation that Mike Harris got rid of course, is what was called anti-scab legislation, anti-replacement worker legislation. Why is that important? That we had that, we lost it, we need it back?
Yeah, that was a very important piece where workers, had they chosen to use the only leverage they really have as a collective group of workers, if the negotiations process doesn't work out successfully, then of course they withdraw their labor. Since we've lost that piece of legislation where people can cross a legal picket line, we have now seen picket lines where it's much more less peaceful, where you have potentially one group of low-wage workers trying to improve their life, their working conditions by having a union, to only have another group of usually precarious workers, usually from a temporary agency, crossing that picket line and doing work often for minimum wage or just above minimum wage. And so then you have one group of workers who are trying to get a fair negotiated collective agreement, having that picket line, withdrawing their labor, to only have another group cross that picket line. So you can imagine tensions being quite high around that. But it's pitting worker against worker, and potentially low-wage workers against another group of low-wage workers. And that piece of legislation should be changed. We should have anti-scab legislation back in so that workers, if they can't come to a settlement when they have their legal strike, then it provides a solution faster, where an employer will then say, oh my goodness, I better listen to these workers. They're serious around this collective bargaining, and let's try to get to an agreement, rather than having some pretty tense situations with having other replacement workers cross that legal picket line. So it is another piece where, unfortunately, the Conservative government made those changes only to the detriment of the average working person.
Now, there's been a lot in the press lately from Workers' Action and other groups about really just, even the laws that we have, such as they are, they're not great, not being enforced either in terms of lost wages, employers who will go out of business one day under one name, not pay their employees, and then resurrect themselves under a different name, and nobody comes after them. And it seems the employees have an almost impossible time to try to collect their wages. Usually employees that are desperate to find another job pretty quickly, and collecting lost wages is down their list of priorities. Do you see this more and more as well?
We do, unfortunately, and we see it a lot more for those workers who don't have a union inside their workplace. And it's quite terrible, as workers who put in their time, blood, sweat, and tears in some workplaces makes a company profitable, but they're on the bottom of the ladder in terms of getting paid the work that they put in, the wages that they're due, let alone, their vacation or even getting severance sometimes is a big battle for workers to get what's rightfully owed to them for the work that they've done. But everybody else gets paid first. And again, I think that is deplorable. It should not be happening in that way. What we also see with legislation or in the way that companies can run, it allows them to do exactly what you said, Sherry, where they can operating one day, they don't want to pay up, they close it and they reflip it. And then often what they'll do is some of the gains that workers may have achieved, when they reopen as a new business, they will pay at minimum wage or just a little bit above minimum wage. So then people start all over again for pretty much the same kind of work, pretty much the same employer, but just a different company name. We've seen this for many decades, for example, in the retail sector, where if even with our unionized retail workers, if they would not agree to very minimal wage increases and minimal changes in working conditions, they would often threaten to close a store down, a grocery store, and say, we can open up another one a couple of blocks away. So they use this threat of closing a store and then reopening and people having to start all over again. And this is where Unifor last year had said enough is enough. That's taking place in these retail workers, in precarious workers, where an employer, a company would threaten to close and then make people start all over again. And we said, you know what, we're ready to take on that challenge, and we will not be accepting these sorts of threats. And we mobilize educated workers, and boy, oh boy, they really understood and supported their union to take on that employer and saying, retail workers used to be one of the higher paying jobs where I remember 20 years ago even, folks were making $25 plus an hour with a defined benefit pension plan and a whole lot of other great working conditions and benefits. And there was a slow deterioration over the decades. So we've seen this change. And by the way, when we did some big rounds of bargaining last year and into this year, we haven't had a single grocery store end up closing and then reopening somewhere else. We were able to make those achievements, make gains. Minimum wage increases have been great, but we've also been able to negotiate what we call a minimum wage plus clause. So no matter what, they will be over and above minimum wage. If minimum wage continues to change legislatively, that we will still be higher and continue to raise the standard of living for these retail service sector workers. And they didn't lose a job. But the company knew that these workers were serious and they were tired of being taken advantage of. And that's what I think we need to do more often collectively, sending strong messages to corporations where their CEOs make millions and millions and millions of dollars, not just on their annual salaries, but in their bonuses and things like that. And we've really got to level that kind of the sharing of the profits and making it a little bit more. I'd like to see it a lot more equitable, but keep moving that bar so that the gap between the CEOs and the executives making so much more than the workers that are making these corporations so profitable.
And there's another scam, too, that I want you to weigh in on. That is not calling them employees at all, but actually treating them as if they're a small business, as they're contracting out. So I think of many of whom clean government buildings, for example, but they're seen as a small business. So they have to bid on their own jobs, and they end up making less than minimum wage, but not covered by minimum wage legislation because, hey, they're not an employee. They're a small business person contracting out to a larger company. And of course, also competing with all the other quotes unquote small business people. This is something that, to me, it's a scam, but this is something we're seeing as well out there. And I'm sure you are.
Yes, we've seen that time and time again as well. And again, here is a group of workers who might be at minimum wage, might be less, and then competing with other workers at this minimum wage or less, and that shouldn't be happening, I don't believe, and I don't think that we should have these companies or small businesses that contract and get contract flips, and we're seeing that too often as well. Rather than being directly employed by that workplace for cleaning services, that company contracts it out to another business and, is absolved of any sort of responsibility for the workers who are cleaning and taking care of their facilities. And I think that the lack of accountability and responsibilities of different companies is on even more of a growing rise as well. And this is sort of the hidden workers who come in late at night, when offices or buildings are not in operation and they're doing this cleaning, for example. And again, it's an area of work that is continuously growing in precariousness, and it doesn't help our economy one bit, I don't believe. If people are making low wages, they're struggling to contribute to their local economy. You have parents who have to work 2, 3 part-time or full-time with part-time jobs, so they're not home to take care of their kids as well as they probably would like to, not being able to be there as their kids grow into teenage years, for example. And that, I think, is an overall detriment to our entire society, where parents are struggling, working 2, 3 different jobs to make ends meet, and they're not there to play a much more active role. Because I know these parents would love to do more than they're capable and the time that they can allot to being there for their kids. But, it's a choice of having the wages to feed their family or having to be away. And it's a terrible decision, I think, that anybody is in.
By the way, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Three Women here on CIUT 89.5 FM. I'm your host, Sherry DeNovo, MPP Parkdale High Park, and we're on the phone with Jenny On, who is the Executive Assistant to the National President of Unifor, Jerry Diaz, among many other hats that she wears. We're talking about, on this show, precarious workers. Jenny, one last thing before I let you go. We've been talking about the low end of the income spectrum, but the reality of precarious work and non-unionized work is that hits college professors too. We're sitting at the University of Toronto campus, and I know that there are hundreds of part-time, precariously employed teachers here who do exactly the same job as as the full-time profs, but get paid often about 50% of what they do. There was an article today in the Star about California where they're bringing in or brought in legislation where the hourly rate for exactly the same work has to be the same. Comments on that?
Well, I think that makes things fair and level, and I do think that we can learn from that. I'm sure folks have heard about the fight for $15 as a minimum wage campaign. We're seeing a rise of successes where different cities and states in the United States have implemented that. And there's obviously some work here in the province around pushing for a $15 minimum wage. It's also an initiative in several other provinces in Canada. I think where we can level the playing field so that it's the equal pay for equal work. What a new fancy concept in this day and age, that we're not there in almost every industry. And yes, colleges, universities have precarious workers. We have it in our healthcare. We have it in manufacturing. Whether it's hotels and hospitality, even in the airlines. And as I mentioned, in retail and other service sector workplaces, but not just isolate to service sector workplaces, that We need to have less precarious work, less contract work, better wages, and better increases. Although, we've had these increases in the province, we should be at least a $15 minimum wage, if not higher, if people are going to live and earn a livable wage. And we need to see that right across the board, so we don't have workers struggling, pitting one low-wage worker against another low-wage worker. And again, every industry is taking advantage of this growing precariousness of working conditions and workplaces, and we really need to put a stop to that. We need to tell those politicians who are not supportive of it that if they're not going to stop precarious work, then they should not be getting our vote at the end of the day, that they have to look out for all of the citizens in this province to ensure that nobody is living in poverty in 2016. It is quite incredible and sad that here we are in 2016, and there are so many people, not just young people, as you've mentioned, Sherry, that are in these low-wage, precarious type jobs. These are, parents, families, and older adults working in these low-wage, precarious jobs, and it really should be unacceptable, and we really should be fighting for changes.
Thank you. We've been speaking to Jenny On, as I said, executive assistant to the national president of Unifor, Jerry Diaz, and we thank you, Jenny, for being on Three Women. Take care.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Great show.
And just so you know, out there in Radio Land, if you want to weigh in on this conversation, we're always happy to hear from you. You can phone in if you're the extrovert sort, 416-946-7000. Or if you just want to tweet me, and I want to thank those who have been tweeting. We've had some very interesting tweets in. Someone tweeted in about what's Kathleen Wynne doing to address this issue. Good question. Wants everybody, all the leaders of the political parties in Ontario, to weigh in on this, and especially mentions employment agencies because, yes, they can be a real problem in the temporary help field. Again, it allows the employers to just offload their responsibilities, that is paying benefits of any sort and guaranteeing any sort of work to a third party, and that has been a real problem. We now have on the line Tenzin Nawang. Tenzin, welcome to Three Women.
Hi, Sherry. Thanks for having me.
So, Tenzin, let's talk about a particular labor action that just happened that was really unusual in a whole lot of aspects, and that was out at our food depot. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I heard about the strike on the radio, actually. CBC did a short segment on it. And I had heard that most of the workers were Tibetan. And, being Tibetan, I called up a few friends. I said, hey, did you know about the strike? Maybe we should go and help out. And got a few people together and really got to know the strikers. So there were a number of issues that they were, facing. There was workplace abuse and harassment, discrimination, wage theft. But when they went on strike, it was for their first collective agreement. A key concern was around wages. They had joined Teamsters Local 419 in November of last year, and since then they had been trying to negotiate their first contract with their employer. So they went on strike on Thursday, April 21st, and there were 14 of them, and most of them were Tibetan. So that's unusual in the sense that Tibetans organizing at their workplace. This was the first time I had heard of it. I mean, there may be other Tibetans organizing, but at this workplace here at Fresh Taste, the majority of them were Tibetan. So this was unusual in that sense, and the community really rallied around them.
Now, what were these folk doing? Most of them, what was their job?
So they're warehouse workers. There was, a few of them drove.
And this is at the food depot where all the food comes in and gets distributed. Yep.
Exactly. So they supply to Metro, to Sobeys, to smaller, some of the independent grocery stores. A lot of the Parkdale grocery stores actually get their produce from Fresh Taste. And most of the workers are warehouse workers. They package up produce, they do the inventory, they drive the trucks. Yep.
And what was their issue? What was the problem with their hourly rate? Why did they start going, and then when they first started to go out on strike, of course, they weren't unionized at that point, were they?
They actually had unionized last November, but they didn't have a first contract.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
so when they went on strike, like I said, the key issue was wages. Most of the food terminal workers who were doing the same work as they were getting paid, $19.50, $20, $21 an hour, and there were workers at Fresh Taste who were earning $14.50. There was one worker who has been working there, I believe, 14 years. He started there at $12 an hour, and he was earning $14.50 at the end of 14 years of, this backbreaking work. So that was a key concern. Yeah,
it's awful. And yeah, as you said, back-breaking work. And maybe because you're Tibetan, Tenzin, tell us a little bit about, what got them here to Toronto, because these are, there's a backstory to every Tibetan in the city. And what is that backstory?
Right. So many of the workers were from India. And although I didn't get to talk to all of them, I spoke to a number of them. And, one of them had come only 2 or 3 years ago. One of the shop stewards, Tenzin, he was kind of the leader, and everyone kind of rallied around him. He has been here for, I think, over 12 or 13 years, maybe more. And most of them live in Parkdale. It's convenient for them to get to the food terminal from here. And the Tibetan community here is just thriving. Most of us, we came here pretty recently. I mean, the wave really started in the early sort of 2000s. I mean, there were Tibetans coming here since the 70s, but in Parkdale, we really started getting a lot of Tibetans in the 90s and the early 2000s. So a lot of them were part of that wave in the early 2000s. And like I said, most of them were from India. And when they came here, that the first job that they could find was in this industry, in this sector. There are, I believe, 400 Tibetan workers at the food terminal. There are a number of other companies. Some are unionized, most aren't. So a lot of the other, their friends and colleagues at the other companies were watching them, very closely to see how this would go, because, this is unprecedented. A number of Tibetans, for them, this is the first time organizing around workplace issues and for better wages.
And, what was particularly discouraging to me, and I think I said this in media requests when I went out there to support them, that, the story of Tibetans in exile really is a story of, a country that was overrun, where Tibetans are oppressed, that's been occupied by another country, in this case China, and so many of, if not they themselves, but many of their relatives, escaped through the Himalayas, really, to go to another country, to end up in Canada only to be treated like this. It just seemed outrageous to me.
Exactly. And I think that, because of that, I think that the community here is very cohesive, very strong, and very united. And we saw that in their organizing. They were very steadfast. They said, we are going for, this contract or nothing. And there were many instances where the employer tried to break them up, tried to, divide and conquer. He sent down envelopes to the picket line with their names on, individual envelopes, and each one had, a certain promise to each worker saying, I'll raise your wage by this much. And they all got together and they said, we're not opening this, and they all tore it up. And, that's something that they told me, and there was so much pride in their voices. They said, we're not that easy to deceive, or, we're united. So, yes, they've gone through a lot, multiple dislocations from Tibet to India to, Canada now, and a lot of people go through other places as well. And unfortunately, precarious employment does affect everyone, but there are groups that are affected disproportionately, and I'm talking about women, newcomers, people of color, differently abled people, migrant workers. They're simultaneously experiencing racism, xenophobia, dislocation, language barriers, isolation. And when I was talking to the strikers, that's something they mentioned, at the workplace, when they were trying to kind of talk to the employer about raising their wages, the employer would say things like, if you're not happy here, go back to where you came from. Well, you can't go back to Tibet. It's impossible. So there's that mixed in there as well.
I can't believe they're using that line. That's like the racist line from 5 decades ago or something. By the way, I didn't introduce Tenzin well. She is a community legal worker with Parkdale Community Legal and a member of Tibetan Women's Association, and someone is tweeting, is asking about exactly what you raised, Tenzin, and that is precarious work and oppressive work, like the place we're just describing, and especially in high-risk neighborhoods and for people of color. So your work at the legal clinic, you must see not just Tibetans, but a lot of other people who are subject to this as well.
Yes, I'm in the immigration division, so my work involves mostly immigration issues, but we do have a workers' rights division, and they're involved in organizing around better conditions and helping people with their individual legal problems as well. And a lot of times people think about precarious work as associated with just service sector jobs, but things are different now, and things are changing, and precarious work is spreading to jobs that were once considered stable employment with benefits and pensions. I mean, you have Toronto Library workers. I read in an article a few weeks ago that it takes 10 years to become permanent with benefits at the library. Yeah, that's a shame.
It's awful. Well, hey, and a lot of people are working on contracts.
That's right.
That because even for frontline social service agencies, they can never depend on their funding. So, this precariousness gets passed on down the line. We're going to take a bit of a break now. We're going to listen to Tanika Charles, and we're going to come back in a few minutes. Again, keep those tweets coming. We love them here. If you want to phone in, you're welcome to do that too. 416-946-7000 here on Three Women. We're talking about those jobs that you've got, but you want something better because you're contract, part-time, precariously employed. Back at you in just a few minutes.
Woke up in the usual way. Whole world's looking the same. Looking in on my day-to-day. Money I make earns away. Gotta pay rent today. Wanna make moves but I can't. Your love keeps me safe. Love to love you but I gotta get paid. Pay. Working on a chain gang. Working downtown on Queen. I gotta get paid. I gotta get paid, working on the chain gang, living in Parkdale. Living in Parkdale. Grab my bike, hit the tape, roll the fresh, copy shade. Hey girl, ain't that hot? Yes it is. You got the chopping but I couldn't stay. Wanna say to your face, you're the one that takes the cake. My world's good today. Glad you love me, but I gotta get paid. Pay. Working on a chain gang, working downtown on Queen. I gotta get paid. I gotta get paid. Working on the chain gang, living in Parkdale. Living in Parkdale.
Stress and struggle of concrete hustle around here. We don't walk, we do the Parkdale shuffle. In the days they used to call that shit the Parkdale shake. Now we reserve that time for when we dancing with Jake. Chances are they in their cars just watching the breaks. Is what it is. Hold the rep for these kids. They on the tape. Down and out with the down and outs trying to live. Everybody get their little grind on. Wonder when the time comes. Sort of shit you die from. Child ask your mommy why ain't the lights on? No one else is themselves to rely on. Ooh, it won't be you. You'll drive on through. We call the strip the Parkdale Zoo. Where you drive on by to see the creatures in view. On your way downtown now to do what you do. Crack block, find work if you can flip up a skirt. Kill her, start the day just saying gotta get paid.
Pay. Working on a chain gang, working downtown on Queen. I gotta get paid. I gotta get paid. Working on the chain gang, living in Parkdale. Living in Parkdale. downtown all week, I gotta get paid. I gotta get paid. Working on the chain gang, living in Park Day. Living in Park Day.
Right here, right now, every day. CIUT 89.5, Toronto. Sound of your city.
And we are back here live on Three Women, and we're talking about, yes, the jobs that most of us have. Actually, over 50% of Ontarians work on contract, precariously, part-time, and are worried where the next paycheck is coming from. And we're not always in the service sector. Just talking to Tenzin Nawang, we were talking about the Fresh Taste strike, and I want to get back to that. She's a worker at Parkdale Community Legal and also a member of Tibetan Women's Association. So Tenzin, tell us what happened with that strike, because it really is an encouraging story.
So in the beginning, there was very little support, mainly because nobody knew about it, and the media coverage focused on the strike more as a traffic delay situation rather than the issues that they were trying to highlight. So once the community got involved, we had a lot of solidarity from not only members of the Tibetan community, but from the wider community of labor organizers and allies. And once that got started and people started talking about it and talking to the strikers, and there was some media coverage focusing on exactly what the strike was about, then we saw sort of the employers more willing to talk, because we were hearing from the strikers, and the strikers said that their friends told them that the employer's been telling other people, oh, we're going to let them sit out until Christmas, we're going to be okay. They were using scab labor. They were people who didn't even have the correct license to operate some of the machinery. And that was something that really concerned the workers. They said, how is this legal? How are they able to do this? We're out here asking for better working conditions, and the employer is not affected at all. He's just using, other workers to replace us.
This was shocking, and this is something we spoke about earlier in the program, was the fact that under that pre-Mike Harris, we did have anti-replacement or anti-scab legislation in Ontario, and then he got rid of it, and the Liberals have never brought it back. So this is a very dangerous situation for both sets of workers, really, and of course takes any kind of incentive away from the employer to settle or to negotiate in good faith, right?
Exactly. But, like I said, the workers are very united. They were out there picketing every, their shift starts usually around midnight or 1, so they were out there from midnight or 1 until noon the next day, or 1 p.m. sometimes. And they were, strong and united, and once the community sort of heard about their demands and came out to support them, we planned solidarity pickets. It was a little difficult for them because this was the first time they had ever striked. They didn't quite, know what would happen going in. And once the community came out, and once we started, rallying wider support, they were also their morale was really boosted. They said, after it all ended and after they won, they were striking for about, I want to say 12 days, and they were able to get what they wanted. They spoke at a meeting of labor organizers, and they said, next time anyone goes on strike, we're going to be there. We know how important it is, because it really does help when people are driving by and honking in support. That really does something,
And it's the only thing, what else do workers have, really, in a situation like that where they can be fired? They need a union, and they need solidarity, and then, they can actually win, which is a good message, because people think, it's all gloom and doom, but There's these victories that keep us going.
Yeah, it's the little things, right? Yeah.
So what did they end up winning in essence?
So they got their first contract. They were happy with it, and they voted in favor of it, and they are better informed about their rights. One moment where it really kind of got me thinking was where one of the workers was talking to someone who was writing an article on their strike, and he said, for so many years we've faced this kind of workplace bullying and discrimination and harassment and no increase in wages even after working there several years, that we thought it was normal. We thought that's just that's what everyone has to go through. And only after we started talking to other people and kind of organizing, we realized that it's really not fair. So I feel like a lot of people who are in these precarious jobs and working these long hours without benefits or without any increase in wages, they feel like maybe this is normal, and that's something that we have to fight against.
Well, that's another part of it too, is the education. I mean,
right.
Folk need to know what their rights are, and a lot of recent immigrants and refugees don't know what their rights are, and not just in employment, but housing, everything else. So they really are at the mercy of folk, especially without the necessary language skills, et cetera, to figure it out.
And even if they're part of a union, I mean, if there's a language barrier and their union rep doesn't speak that language, their language, then, there's only so much you can communicate. So there's that issue of good representation as well.
And it's kind of interesting because the overriding philosophy behind at least my experience of Tibetan Buddhism, of course, is nonviolent resistance, which is really inspiring to the rest of the world. Hence, His Holiness the Dalai Lama got Nobel Peace Prize, and this is a really good example of nonviolent resistance. Really, to go out on strike, and all you're doing really is taking away your labor and letting people know about the conditions in your place of work. It's a pretty nonviolent way of getting and affecting some significant change, I think. Just even joining a union, for that matter. Yeah,
I mean, like I said, this is a very new experience for many Tibetans, organizing for better wages. I mean, I feel like a lot of Tibetans feel like that's maybe not the best kind of tactic, to publicly say you want more. I mean, it's just this Tibetan thing where you're seen as greedy, or but these workers, they were able to organize and win this fight. And I think that a lot of other Tibetans in the community have started talking about their own kind of workplace situations. I mean, after the strike, I got a call from someone who is a personal support worker, PSW, and she had so many questions about her rights. And she was part of a union, but she didn't feel comfortable talking to her union representative because of the language barrier. That's why I mentioned that, right? Because even though you are a part of a union, if you're not able to communicate with your union, you're limited in what you can do and what you can find out. So I think this is a big win for the community, for sure.
And it's interesting, again, for new immigrants, people of color, to really see this kind of victory for people in pretty, the kind of low job range, professions. And I think it should inspire those who perhaps are making a little bit more money than that and feel that they're professionals to relook at their work situations too. I was saying to Jenny that it's not always all low paid workers that are in precarious or part-time or contract work. It's also teachers, as people who are in the social service field, people are frontline workers, people with university educations who have the language skills, who are also working in contract temporary work. And I know, and you're young, Tenzin, I'm sure a lot of your friends are not in full-time professional jobs with guaranteed benefits that chances are they'll stay in for the rest of their lives. Who does that anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I read a statistic that really, I mean, it puts things in perspective. More than a quarter of precarious jobs require a university degree. So, I mean, you have, thankfully, you have people talking about this now. It's, it's part of the discourse. There are people organizing around this. You have Andrew Cash with the Urban Worker Project, where the aim is to talk about some of these kind of loopholes in our labor laws that don't protect young workers, or independent contractors,
or work as interns, of course. Which,
right.
Which he and Jonah also were very active around, and Workers' Action, of course. But I mean, there's another situation where highly educated young people will work for nothing in various areas to hopefully to get hired on at something that comes up, but not everybody can afford that. So it becomes, the purview of people with families with money that can afford for their child to work for nothing. Or they have money coming in from somewhere else, because most, and certainly for people of color and new immigrants, that's really not an option to work for nothing. I mean,
no. Whenever I see a posting for an unpaid internship, and no matter how great the company or the position, I just think that's just out of reach for so many who need to work in the summer to pay off loans or pay for their tuition to live.
Now, at Parkdale Legal, as you mentioned earlier, they do an amazing job, actually, on a lot of fronts, for precarious work, for workers' rights, also for housing issues, and, of course, in your area, in immigration. What do you see as immigrants who are coming into the country, who are trying to get that first step, the first job? What is that looking like these days?
It's hard. It's hard for newcomers to find work. First of all, everyone wants some Canadian experience, and then you have young people who are coming here with a university degree from back home. That it takes a lot of money and time and energy to get that recognized here in Canada. So it has to do with how our government treat newcomers. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. We need to do better with welcoming newcomers, not only in the sense of welcoming them here, but also making it easier for them to find work by recognizing their degrees from wherever they're coming from.
What should we be doing? You say recognizing their degrees. I mean, there's usually this length. They tend to be professionals, for example, engineers, nurses, medical folk.
Even just a BA. I met someone who came here just a few months ago, and she came here from Nepal, and she has a BA, but now she has to go through this process where she has to pay to get that kind of, they assess her credentials, and that's a long process, and she's worried now that she won't make it in time to apply to school for the fall. I think that there's room for improvement there, for sure.
And to charge somebody for that process seems bizarre, really. I mean, that should be something that some bureaucrat has as part of their job description, one would hope.
And then you have other groups who are coming here whose employment conditions are so restrictive, and there's so much room for exploitation. You have live-in caregivers who, upon arrival, they are tied to one employer, and that's the condition of they have conditional work permits, and they have to work for 2 years with an employer or employers before they can apply for permanent residency. And there's just so much room there for abuse. That's something, again, that if there's political will to change, I think at the federal level they can certainly change that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tricky in terms of recognizing. I mean, this is something that I remember doing some town halls with those professional organizations in the medical engineering field, and asking what proactively they were doing to try to make it easier for foreign trained professionals. to get accredited and to get into their professions. And it was still daunting. It was incredibly difficult. I remember there was a situation with a chap. He was a surgeon in an area we desperately needed surgeons in, who was trained in Iran. I mean, the human body, quite frankly, is not that different between Iran and here. Anyway, he was trained, and he was in his 40s. It takes a long time to become a surgeon there as here. And he said that basically what he was going to be required to do was to go back to school for about 8 years before he could, with residency and everything else, before he could practice here. So instead his family stayed, and he's still in a situation, I imagine, where he goes and works there for 6 months and then comes back and stays with them for 6 months. This seems to me a ridiculous waste of human capital. You must see this kind of thing too.
Yes, I hear about it quite often.
So what can we do at both provincial and federal level? What do you think we should be doing as governments to make this better?
Well, at the provincial level, I think that the changing workplace review is, so crucial, and that there are several groups who have submitted, recommendations to the provincial government to make our laws fairer. And I think one of the easy things that would, I think, make a difference to strikers in the future, to people like Tenzin, who was at Fresh Taste, and trying to organize, is just making it easier to join a union. They were talking about how it's taken them so many years to get to this point where they trust each other to be able to go ahead and organize, to join a union. And before that, they said there was a lot of fear and mistrust because they thought that if somehow the boss got wind of their discussions, that they would be fired. So I think that that's one easy thing that the Labor Relations Act could be changed to accommodate that. And then there are a number of things on the federal level I think that we could do. Giving caregivers status on arrival. There was a rally today that was organized by the Coalition for Migrant Workers' Rights Canada, and that's one of their kind of demands, is to give living caregivers status upon arrival, so they don't have to be tied to a situation where there's abuse or exploitation.
Explain that, because a lot of people listening probably don't know about what a caregiver has to go through. So explain what happens now.
Exactly. And now there's new legislation being kind of considered to tie the work permits to an employer, to a recruiting agency. And that just adds another layer of complication for the workers. The living caregivers do not want that. And the Migrant Workers Alliance has been pushing for the government to pay attention to the living caregivers, the people who are actually going to be affected by these changes. But
so people who are listening, but they don't know that, when you come over as a live-in licensed nanny to somebody, you can come to the country, but it takes you, 2 years? Yeah. You have to be with an employer for 2 years before you can either switch employment or,
before you can apply for permanent residency.
Apply for permanent residency, which means that if you happen to go into a very abusive household, you're stranded. You because you risk losing everything. The reason you came here in the first place. If you complain or if you try to get out, and there's no recourse, it's absolutely horrendous, that program. Exactly. So
and not to speak of the wait times. Once you do, your 2 years. Once you complete those 2 years, you apply for permanent residency. And a lot of the living caregivers who are taking care of children here in Canada have children of their own back from wherever they're from, whether it's the Philippines or India or Malaysia or Indonesia. They have young children, they have spouses. So when they apply for permanent residency, they include their families on their application because they obviously want to be reunited. And the application right now, the processing times for living caregivers is at 49 months, and usually it takes longer than that. So they're separated from their families, sometimes for 7, 8, 9 years.
And be at the mercy of their employers, really.
Exactly. So that's certainly something that the federal government can do something about.
which is shocking. And of course, earlier we were speaking with Jenny about making it easier to join unions. I mean, things like what they call card check certification, so that you don't have to wait this 5 days where you can be harassed by an employer. There's a whole sectoral organizing, which they have a number of European countries where if you, for example, organize a Walmart, then de facto all the Walmarts organize. You don't have to organize each outlet of a large company, which of course is exhausting and often unsuccessful. So, I mean, all of that is really, and paying equal pay for equal work, which sounds so as if we don't, I mean, I'm just shocked we don't have it already. But if you're working part-time, you should be making and doing exactly the same job. Then you should be making the same amount as an hourly wage as somebody who's working full-time and it's the same job. So anything else, like so maybe you can help us with some basics here, Tenzin. I'm talking, by the way, to Tenzin Nawang, community legal worker for Parkdale Legal, and we started off talking about the Fresh Taste strike, which was successful and in a relatively short period of time, although it was cold out there. And for folk who really found their voice, new immigrants who really found their voice and had a great success. So congratulations to them. What can others do? If you were advising someone, they're in a situation where they're being exploited, they don't feel they have any rights, they're scared they're going to be fired. What would your advice be to them?
I mean, I think that there's definitely strength in numbers. So talk to your colleagues. You don't have to, if you're not comfortable, talk to them at the workplace. You can organize outside. Reach out to allies. Seek out allies in, whether it's in unions or whether it's in other workplaces that have successfully organized. So I know at the food terminal, they have 20 to 30 companies, and only 6 or 7 of them are unionized. So, that's something that people have a resource in their colleagues, in their friends and neighbors, and they can talk to them. I think that once you trust people in your workplace and you start talking, you can organize around issues, and you're stronger than the boss or the employer when you stand together.
Absolutely. And another thing I would add, too, is the Ministry of Labor. I do it with a good amount of hesitancy because I know that, they really do not enforce the laws very well. But you do have rights if you're not getting the paychecks that you think your hourly work entails, or if you're being asked, on the spur of the moment to do shift work that you weren't prepared for. There are a whole host of things you may have questions about. And you can go online to the Ministry of Labor, and you can make complaints there as well. Obviously, though, in small workplaces, that's problematic because they may know where the complaint came from. But again, it's there for you, and you should definitely use it, or somebody can phone on your behalf to maybe get a spot check, especially if there's dangerous work involved, which is something we didn't even have time to get into because there is health and safety regulations that often do get broken and put workers' lives at risk. So if there's something that seems unsafe, that you think is unsafe, you don't have to do it.
And you also have your community legal clinics, the ones that do employment law. You can turn to them for advice, and, they can also represent you.
Yeah. And again, we are talking to Tenzin Nawang, a community legal worker, about the situation at Fresh Taste, which was an amazing success for precariously employed employees, Tibetans in this case. First-time Tibetans had gone out on strike and made their voices heard in that way. But it's an object lesson for other immigrant groups who maybe are new to the country and are a little hesitant to use their voice in situations like that. And just to know that when you do, and as Tenzin said, if you organize with others, there are those there to support you. So thank you very much, Tenzin. Thanks for being on Three Women.
Thank you for having me, Sherry.
You're welcome. And thank you to those who've tweeted in. And yes, Andres, thank you for thanking me for highlighting Precarious and work and the essential role of unions. There's no doubt that it is an essential role. The sad reality is 2 out of 3 Ontario workers are not unionized, and many of those are the ones that are in precarious work. And something we didn't get a chance to get into as well are all of those laid off middle management people who are doing consulting work, who are at home on the computer, who may get paid extremely well when there's work and may get paid nothing when there isn't, and certainly don't have benefits. And all of this leads to, of course, retiring without a pension for 2 out of 3 Ontarians as well. So, again, the whole world of precarious work. You're listening to Three Women. I'm your host, Sherry DeNovo, MPP Parkdale High Park, and I love to hear from you. So do keep those tweets coming. Also, and you can follow me at Cheridinovo, or that's my Facebook handle too.